Hello again, and thank you for joining me for week 2 of the Growing for Better Health course. This is the horticulture segment that will accompany a nutrition segment taught by Lisa Martin, the FNIP and SNAP-Ed agent for K-State Research and Extension in Shawnee County. My name is Ariel Whiteley-Knoll, and I am the horticulture agent for K-State Research and Extension in Shawnee County. Today, we are going to be talking about soil, water, and compost. Really important elements of gardening, maybe not everybody's favorite, but it should be. These are really foundational things to having a successful garden. And I find that a lot of times problems that people incur later in the season could have been avoided with just more planning up front, more thought to start the season can really help you to avoid some common pitfalls later in the year. So to begin today, I just want to remind everybody that K-State is an equal opportunity and affirmative action employer. K-State Research and Extension programs and materials are open to all without regard for race, color, national origin, sex, gender, gender identity, religion, age, height, weight, disability, political beliefs, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, or veteran status. So to start with today, we're going to be talking about healthy soils, and you can find this on page 13 in your Kansas Garden Guide. As a reminder, I talked about it last week. Kansas Garden Guides can be purchased at your local K-State Research and Extension office, or you can find it for free online, and I will link that in this recording. So when we talk about building a healthy soil, there are a few things that go into that. I touched on it last week, but we need to get a soil test. No one knows what nutrients, what pH your soil is, unless you get a soil test. There are generalizations for our state. There are generalizations for our area, but those are not as accurate as getting a soil test. Soil tests are very affordable. Usually they're between $10 and $15 for a single test. And in Shawnee County, many times we have cost share money, and that can cover part or all of your test. There are other extension offices across the state that may have different policies, but really you think about, even if you had to pay $15 and you had to do several tests and you think about the cost, most of the time when people get results back, at least the results that I look at here in Shawnee County, they need to apply less than they were planning. They have plenty of potassium, or their pH is perfectly adequate. And so getting a soil test may seem like an investment now, but it's really an investment that's going to save you money throughout the growing season. So don't skip the soil test. Of course, when you get the soil test, amend in accordance with it. Don't ignore it. Don't say, oh, well, I'll just go ahead and apply phosphorus, even though I have a lot of phosphorus. There are instances where you can actually do damage to your plants by applying too much of something. But more importantly, it's a waste of your time. It's a waste of your money, and it can be harmful to the environment. So amend your soil as your soil test recommends. Organic matter can also be really helpful to add to your soil. Most of us have clay, very sticky soils like that are pictured here in this part of Kansas and eastern Kansas. Organic matter, which can be compost or ground up leaves or grass clippings, can all help that. I will say if you are adding a lot of compost, you should do that and then get a soil test. I would recommend like adding compost in the fall and then get a soil test in the spring to allow those things to sort of marinate together. If you add a really high nitrogen compost and you've already done a soil test before you added it, and then the soil test is most likely going to tell you to add nitrogen, you may be adding too much. So I would recommend incorporating compost into your soil in one season, the following season getting a soil test, and then amending based on that. Soil should never be bare. When there is an area of bare soil, a little piece of me dies. It's just going to erode in the rain. It's not healthy. Nature doesn't leave bare soil, and we shouldn't either. So in between your rows, in between your plants, you need to make sure that you're mulching. You can use a wood mulch. You can use aged straw. You can use grass clippings as long as you let them dry first and then sprinkle them around the plants. If you add wet grass clippings around your plants, a lot of times they create a mat and water actually runs off. It doesn't infiltrate. So if you do grass clippings, let them dry and then sprinkle them around the plants. Ground up leaves, compost can be a great mulch just on top of things. Just make sure that we're not leaving bare soil. Bare soil is not healthy for our garden. And also along the same vein, drip irrigation can be really helpful. So if we think about areas of bare soil and then we're either blasting them with the hose or the water's coming down, or even if you use a mulch, sometimes those things can get washed away or pushed away with a lot of water. So by putting drip irrigation around each of your plants and making sure that you've got water coming to each plant and then doing a mulch on top of that, you're really helping to make sure that the water gets where it needs to go, which is at the root of the plant. Tomato leaves don't need water. And actually watering tomato leaves is a really good way to spread disease. Tomato roots need water. So drip irrigation is a great way to get that water where it needs to go. And then after you've done your soil test, if you get a really crazy value and your extension agent can help you interpret this, you might want to test sooner, but typically every 3 to 5 years is when you need to get another soil test. So we're talking about what a soil test measures. What do you think? And I'm going to say this out loud. And if you're in your home or you're in a classroom, I want you to yell it back at me, even though I can't hear it. Which of these things do you think a soil test measures? Specifically the soil test that K-State does. You're right. I'm going to assume that you all said it right. A soil test is not going to check for insects. A soil test does not measure for diseases or poisons. Now, there are some labs in the United States that can check for chemicals, but that is not what our lab does. Our lab tests for soil pH and available nutrients. So that's what we're looking at when we're talking about measuring for soil tests. I don't want to get too much off topic, but it's worth mentioning. I have a lot of calls every year about my soil is poison. That's why my plants won't grow. I want you to test my soil because I think my neighbor dumped something on it. I think there's a chemical on it, et cetera, et cetera. I've had a lot of calls like that in the last 5 years. I've been in extension and never once has that been the case. It's because someone's not watering. It's because a plant got a disease. It's usually environmental. And while I am certain that somewhere in the world, someone's neighbor probably has poisoned a plant, it's really not something that happens regularly. I think people want to point towards the soil having some kind of poison in it because that seems, I don't know, maybe it seems easy. Most of the time it's the environment. A lot of times it's either what people are doing or not doing to take care of their plants. And so our soil test tests for pH and nutrients, and that's helpful information. And I would just really steer you away from thinking that there's something really terrible in your soil that's murdering your plants. It's probably just the way that they're being cared for or the weather conditions. So this is a great video that I am going to actually link in this recording. Just because I don't have my audio settings set up that I'm certain that you'd be able to hear it on the recording. But this is K-State former professor, Dr. Rhonda Yankee, showing you how to take a soil test, how deep to dig, how many samples in an area. So I would really encourage you, I'm going to link it, but please make sure that you take some time to watch this video before a soil test. It's very, very short, and it's really helpful if you've never conducted a soil test before. Oh, looks like it was going to autoplay there. Okay, so now when we're talking about compost, this is going to be on page 9 of your Kansas Garden Guide. This is a really great diagram that our Shawnee County Extension Master Gardeners came up with just to show, and this doesn't have to be exact, but just this gives you an idea of what your compost should be made out of. So it should be made out of about half brown matter. So that's our dry things, leaves, newspaper, shredded cardboard. It should be about 30% green matter, which would be fresh grass clippings, our kitchen scraps, eggshells. Those would all be considered green matter. A little bit of high nitrogen fertilizer can really help to kickstart the composting process. So just about 5% of that. And also, if you put some soil in between your layers, that is going to introduce the soil microbes that are going to help the composting process. So neither the fertilizer nor the soil have to be part of your process, but if you're really wanting to make some great compost and to do it as quickly as possible, those can help a lot. And then one thing that people forget is that your compost pile should be damp, not wet, but damp, like a wet sponge. So about 5% of water. Most of the time, rain is going to take care of this in the spring, but as we get into the summer and you're watering your plants, give your compost pile a little bit of water too, and just try to keep it as damp as a wet sponge. Now, just as important as what to put into your compost is what to leave out of your compost. And there are some things that can be harmful to your plants or harmful to your health, especially when we're talking about growing edible foods that need to be left out of compost. So, oops, I don't know why some of those didn't show up. Oh, it's because my screen's in the way. So diseased plants should be left out. Some diseases can persist through compost, especially if you're not regularly turning or your compost doesn't get up to the right temperature. We're shooting for about 140 to 145 degrees if you want to invest in a compost thermometer and really do the composting intentionally, which I will link our composting publication to talk about that process. But it's best just to leave the diseased plants out. You don't want to take any risks with it. Same thing with weeds. Most weed seeds should be killed in a true composting process. But if you're just sort of piling things up and letting them age, those weed seeds are going to persist. So make sure not to include weeds in your compost pile. Bones and branches are just going to take a really long time to decompose. They're not really good to have in compost. We're going to want to be able to use compost quicker than either bones or branches. Of course, they're going to break down over time, but that's not really for home composting. That's not what you want to include. And then meat is typically the number one thing that attracts raccoons and some of those other things. I get a possum every now and then in my compost pile. She doesn't take enough that really concerns me, but raccoons can be a serious pest, and meat is a very strong odor that can attract them. And then also pet waste. Our domestic pets can carry diseases that we can get as people. So chickens and rabbits, along with horses and cows, if you have those can be a great thing to compost. Make sure you are still fully composting so that you are getting rid of any diseases that they may carry. But dogs and cats in particular, the closer to contact that animals have with people, the less you should use that pet waste. They can definitely carry diseases that can affect us. So it's best just to leave pet waste out. Along those same lines, if you have a pet, the grass clippings from that area shouldn't be used. I always get a lot of leaves in the fall, but I only use the leaves from my side and front yard where my dog is not, because otherwise I do know that there's going to be some pet waste or residue of pet waste in the areas that my pet is. So just think about those things as you're adding to your compost. Some other ways that you can add organic matter outside of sort of a traditional composting method. Verma composting has been really popular lately, which is using worms, usually in a bin in your home, feeding them kitchen scraps and then harvesting that. It's going to be a smaller product, but usually quicker, and I think a little bit more fun, especially if you have kids. This can also be a way if you live in an apartment or a smaller home, you can keep a tub under your sink or in a closet with worms in it and do that verma composting process without having an outdoor compost bin. Sheet mulching can also be really effective, and that's essentially a process of layering cardboard or newspaper, straw, grass clippings, compost if you have it, soil in a space and leaving it over a growing season. So this is something you would do in the early fall, I think is a little bit better. You'd lay it all out. You'd let it sit through the winter, clear into the spring. And in that spring, those layers should have broken down enough that you can plant directly in them. Don't sheet mulch over your existing plants and cover them. When we are composting or we are piling up organic matter, that can get extremely hot. You could damage your plants. You can bury your plants to the point that they can't get out. But if you're starting a garden in a new area, sheet mulching can be a great way to add organic matter over the winter season so that then you can plant in the spring. And then leave the leaves. We get so preoccupied with raking. We are such a raking culture. I want to know how many rakes, per average American household we have, how many leaf blowers, how many leaf bags. We're really obsessed with picking up leaf litter in our culture, and we don't need to. Pollinators oftentimes lay their larvae, that lay their eggs in leaves. Many insects overwinter in leaves. Many birds rely on digging through leaves and eating those things as part of their diet. So as much as possible, try to leave the leaves. I understand that that may not be Possible for everybody. That may not be the type of home or the type of yard that you want to do. But if you can pick an area, a flower bed, a side yard, a behind the garage space to leave the leaves, that can be really helpful for our environment. Me personally, I do try to pick them up on some grass areas or mow them into some grass areas so that it doesn't crowd out my grass in the very little grass that I have. Or in areas like my front yard where the leaves aren't going to stay put, they're only going to blow around. We usually mow over them and then rake some. But in my flower beds, they are left. And what's really great about leaving them in those spaces is I've had plants emerging for several weeks now. We've had quite a few hard frosts, and I don't have to do a thing to those plants. I don't have to go outside with a sheet or with a towel to cover them. Number one, because they're perennials and they have, chosen to emerge at this time. But number two, they have a really nice layer of leaves on them, and that acts like an insulation. And so as much as possible, try to leave the leaves, incorporate them if you can into your garden. And that's really going to help our environment overall. And it may even reduce over time in the fertilizers that you need, because organic matter can add really great nutrients back into the soil. Okay, so now we're going to do an organic matter activity. So I'll explain it, and then you can go ahead and pause the recording to complete the activity. I'd like you to list the types of organic matter that you produce in your home and garden. Is it vegetable scraps? Is it leaves? Is it grass clippings? What are you producing in your home? How are you going to incorporate this organic matter into your soil? And then what are the barriers to your application? So I'd like you to take some time to think about that. People always want to jump right to purchasing fertilizers and purchasing these things, not realizing that you're producing organic matter in your home. So I just want you to take a little bit of time to think about that and to think about how you can apply it to your garden. While you do that, or if you've already paused the recording and you're back with me now, this is just a composting system. If you have the space, I don't, but this is kind of a dream composting system where you have different bays. And a lot of times I see a 3-bay system where you are actively adding to one. So you're putting your kitchen scraps in one, you're putting your grass clippings in one. The other, you're keeping damp and turning regularly. And then the third is finished compost that you're using. And so once you're done using that, hopefully the other one's ready and you can just continue the cycle. So I really like this because it does feel a little daunting. I only have a single compost bin. And so it seems like I'm always either adding to it or pulling from it. And sometimes as I'm pulling from it, I'm having to throw banana peels and things that aren't done sort of back into the pile. So a 3-way system can be really helpful. So you're adding to one, you're sort of maintaining the other, and you're using the third. If you have the space for it, that's kind of an ideal composting setup. So now we're going to talk about fertilizing in the garden, which is going to be page 20 in your Kansas Garden Guide. So when we're talking about fertilizing, well, the main 3 macronutrients we're talking about are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now there are 13 micronutrients, but plants need them in such low volumes. We mostly keep our eye on these 3 macronutrients. When you see a fertilizer bag, you're going to see 3 numbers, and that is the N, the P, and the K, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and it's always going to be in that order, NPK. So when you get your soil test back, it's going to have a recommendation, and you're going to see those 3 numbers on it. Those 3 numbers are going to correlate with products that you're going to find in the store. Now, the reason pH is really important is that if your soil pH is too high or too low, it's going to affect the plant's ability to take up nutrients. So if you get your soil test back and it says, man, you've got plenty of phosphorus, don't worry about applying phosphorus. That doesn't mean that your plants are not phosphorus deficient. If your pH is too high or too low, those plants may not be able to take up the phosphorus, even though it's there in high quantities. So don't sleep on the pH, don't skip the pH, make sure that you're adjusting that just like you're applying the other nutrients, because it's going to affect the plant's ability to take up nutrients. So when we're looking at applying fertilizer for application, there are a few techniques. You can broadcast it. So you can take a granular fertilizer and sort of sprinkle it over an area. And that's that first picture here. You can do row or side dressing. So if you plant a row or you're getting ready to plant a row, and that's the picture that sort of has the rake, the blue rake there, then you can add fertilizer along the side and then cover it back up. And over time, that's going to infiltrate down to the plant roots. You can put it directly in the hole. What I would say is if you're going to dig and then you're going to put fertilizer directly into the hole, watch that you're not doing too much. Still use the same rates that you're going to use for the area. And then I would sprinkle a little bit of soil over the top. Fertilizer can burn plant roots. So I wouldn't put it directly on the roots, but sprinkle a little soil over the top and then put your plant over that. And then you can work it into an entire area or an entire bed, maybe by broadcasting first or using a hand applicator. There are a lot of really affordable hand applicators for fertilizer and seed, and then working it into your soil with some kind of gardening tool. So just an example, I think sometimes people think organic is just inherently better, and it can be depending on your gardening goals, but there are some advantages and disadvantages to both organic and chemical fertilizers, and I just want to point that out. So seed meal, bone meal, and kelp are all going to be examples of organic fertilizer. They're going to come directly from plant or animal sources. They often are sold just like our chemical fertilizers in prepackaged or complete mixes. The advantages to those is they do support soil microorganisms, and that can be really helpful for your long-term soil health. They contain micronutrients along with the macronutrients, and they tend to release those things slowly and over time. Now, the disadvantage to that is they're not going to be available to the plants right away. Those microorganisms are less active in cool temperatures, and so that's really going to slow down the release of nutrients. And in the short term, typically those things are a little bit more expensive. Now, chemical or synthetic or conventional fertilizers are manufactured in some kind of chemical process and then sold as a prepackaged mix. Let me move my video out of the way. They are water soluble, so nutrients are going to be available right away to your soil. And sometimes they're less expensive in the short run. But if we think about organic fertilizer being long-term beneficial, that may even out over time. The disadvantages is they typically are only going to supply those 3 macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, not any micronutrients. They don't add any organic matter to the soil, and usually they leave the soil very quickly. So they're there quickly, but then they leave very quickly. A lot of times chemical fertilizers are concentrated and extremely water soluble, so it is a lot easier to apply too much, and you're going to damage your plants and potentially also the environment. Just because something says organic does not mean it is safe. I really want to caution you, especially beginning gardeners, that if you're using organic products, especially for pest control or weed control, that you are reading the label. You have to read the label. The label is the law. Apply it as directed. Use the appropriate steps, use the appropriate safety measures, even with organic products. Organic products can kill bees. They can kill butterflies. They can do just as much damage as synthetic products if they're not used properly. The label is the law, so this is just your cautionary tale to make sure that you're reading those labels exactly. And if you're using something that doesn't have a label, don't do that. Don't go buy stuff or don't use things under your kitchen sink if there's not a label. If it is not labeled for horticultural use, don't use it, please. That's my one. I'm on my soapbox. I'm back off of it again, but that's my one plea to you. Follow the label. Okay, now we're going to talk about watering, which is going to be on page 25 in your Kansas Garden Guide. So when we're talking about the frequency of watering, we really want to water deeply, but infrequently, and to do so based on the weather. So again, just like we talked about in week 1, look at that Kansas mesonet, look at the rainfall for your area, pay attention to the weather. And when you water, do it deep and slowly. The plant on the left has been watered deeply, but infrequently. Those roots are encouraged to go down, down, down. And in times of drought, they're going to be able to pull from water reserves that aren't available in the first few inches of soil. The plant on the other side has been watered very frequently, very shallowly, and those roots are going out rather than down, which means in times of drought, they're only going to have the first few inches of soil to work with, and they're probably going to be much more drought stressed. So let's take a look at this picture and think about what is wrong with it. And this is another shout at your computer time. What's wrong with this picture? Yes, you all got it right. This is watering in places we don't need water. I can see some tomatoes in here. They are getting drenched head to toe. That is not good for disease transmission. You're watering your trellises. You're watering your hoop house in the background. You're watering your trees up above. You're probably watering your neighbor's yard, which they may or may not appreciate. Very little of that water is going to get down to the plant roots where we need it. So this is not a good example of effective watering. What's wrong with this one? This poor plant. This plant is just getting blasted. So much water, so quickly, it's running away, it's pooling, you're washing soil away from around the plant. Too much. This is like a little baby plant and you're like drowning it. Like this is not what you want. Same thing in this picture. It's great to get kids involved with gardening, but please talk to them about proper watering techniques. You're watering all the leaves, the water's going in lots of different directions, it's coming on really, really fast, not a good use of our water. These are much better ways to irrigate. If you have to use a hose, put it down at the base of the plant. You can see the drops, the space in between the drops on the picture with the blue hose head. It's a slower water. It's coming in slower. It's allowing the plant to take it up. Drip irrigation, if you can do it, it might seem like it's a little bit more of a cost up front to buy an additional hose, but it can be so, so helpful for you. I like to turn my drip irrigation on when I get up in the morning, go get my cup of coffee, let my dog out, feed my dog, do a couple other things, and then come back and turn it off. It's easier for me and it's better for the plants. It's nice and slow. You can see here, this isn't blasting soil away from that middle photo. It's not blasting soil away from the plant. It's doing a nice slow drink. And the last picture, the black and white drawing, that's a really good example of you put your drip irrigation there and you leave that hose, but maybe you have another hose that you bring from a different part of the garden or a water spigot and you can turn it on and turn it off. So I actually think it's also just easier. It's easier on you and it's better for the plants. This is just another example of sort of spraying all over. This is probably a production system, so that might be why it looks a little different. But in the heat of the summer, you're also going to lose a lot of water to evaporation. It's so humid and that water is going to get sucked right up into the air. So you're wasting your time and your money along with the water by spraying it like this. So now we're going to do another activity. I'd like you all to think about your space, to think about where your garden is, and go ahead and make a watering plan. Outline your watering plan, include the technique or techniques you will use. So if you have some pots by the back door, you might water those differently than the 5x5 garden out by your back fence. You might have different techniques. So based on your growing spaces, I'd like you all to take just a couple minutes. You can go ahead and pause this video and outline your watering plan that includes the techniques for the different spaces. And then finally today, we're going to be talking about weeds, and that's going to be on page 24 in the Kansas Garden Guide. When we're looking at weed control, there are a couple options that we have. Soil cultivation, which is hoeing or pulling. You can mulch. So we talked about mulch on the soil conservation side, but mulch is also a great weed suppressant. So organic mulch would be the wood chips, the grass clippings, things like that. You can also use plastic or fabric. Be wary with the plastic that it can heat up. So if you use plastic, you might still want to put something organic over the top of mulch or straw just to keep that temperature down. Pulling or hand picking is always a really valid way. I know it can be kind of an exhausting way, but you're getting the plant. In most cases, that can be very, very effective. Mowing, especially if you're in between rows, can help to reduce weed seed spreading. You can put a cover crop on in between your vegetable crops or your fruit crops, and that is just to make sure that we don't have bare soil. Nature doesn't like bare soil. So if we leave bare soil, nature is going to take care of it. It's going to fill it in with other plants. So cover crops can be really effective on reducing weeds. And then just make sure that you are removing or mowing weeds as you see them, because as soon as they develop that seed head, that's just going to continue to spread and create more of an issue for you. So these are just some examples of what I was talking about. That bottom picture, they used plastic, which is really effective, but then it looks like they put straw in between the rows and mulch around the plants. That mulch can help with water conservation, help to keep it a little bit cooler, but they're probably going to have really good weed suppression in these areas. You can also use more of a fabric if you like, keeping in mind that that's going to break down over time, but it might be a little bit easier to work with than the plastic. A nice thick layer of straw, like is pictured in the upper corner, or you can just do plastic. Again, the reason that this may work for this plant to only be plastic is this is going to be a squash plant, so it's going to spread. So it's going to cover a lot of that plastic, but I would still keep an eye on it to make sure it isn't getting too hot in the summer. And then the last activity for today, just a weed management activity. I'd like you to outline your plan for weed management in your garden. That plan might be that every day I'm going to go out and I'm going to pull any weeds that come up. Mulching should definitely be part of everybody's plan, whether you're mulching pathways or mulching the garden itself, but really go into detail about what is your plan for controlling weeds in your garden. And make sure that you keep in mind the materials you needed initially and the time that you're going to have to dedicate throughout the season. If your plan is hand pulling 100%, that's your whole plan, I'd like to see some serious time that you have set aside to do that, because it's going to take a lot of time. That is the end of today's lesson. I will go ahead and link all the resources that I mentioned, and then I will see you all next week. Thank you so much.